Hello and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program. Remember the Falcon 9? Yeah, I kind of made my own version, but it turns out these legs, they serve no purpose because the first stage is always going to land in the water. So 5 iterations later, we have this version, which technically doesn't need anything on the first stage to recover it, like any extra equipment, but I had already built that stuff in, so I decided to keep it. And I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate a launch for you. The instructions for the launch are in the description, so it tells you exactly what to do, but I'm just going to quickly go through this and show you. So step 1, full throttle, hold vertical. It has a bit of a slow takeoff, but that's just fine. Once you reach 100 meters per second, you want to start pitching over until you have about a 45-degree angle from the vertical. Now, the thing is, at first it will resist you moving over like this because of aerodynamic drag, and once you get to 45 degrees, the rocket will actually be unable to hold a 45-degree angle on its own, and you just let it fall over slowly. So it's still very easy to fly this rocket because most of it is hands-off, which is kind of the point. It's to be reusable, but also minimal effort required. I made a minor course correction there as we were drifting off of the 90 degrees, and you can see we get some aero effects. At burnout, rather than staging, you want to hit 0, then throttle down to 0, stage, throttle up slowly, and then aim at prograde, and continue holding this trajectory. At this point, we are waiting for our time to apoapsis to drop to 5 minutes, or rather increase to 5 minutes, or our apoapsis to get to 200 kilometers. Depending on your payload and how your launch has gone up till this point, one of those two things will be how it is oriented. At this point, we can go ahead and stage the fairing. We are at 45 kilometers, or once the aero effects disappear. As you can see, this test payload is a single ore tank completely full. This is about 17 tons if I remember correctly. So this craft can reasonably hold 17 tons and take it to low Kerbin orbit. As previously stated, now that we've achieved approximately 5 minutes until apoapsis, I will switch back to the first stage. Now, this is the part that could do with some tuning in the future. Right now, this has a probe core, so you can orient it to retrograde and deploy the parachutes. Not that that makes much of a difference this high up, but it will make a difference later on. Of course, they only deploy when safe anyhow, so it's fine. There we go. This will very slowly roll over, and as you can see, we are inside the atmosphere still. This never quite makes it up. This particular mission actually went a little bit better than my last demonstration of this mission, my last test of this mission, where the first stage didn't even get this high up. You can see in Kerbin's ocean below there are a few markers. These markers are from previous iterations of this rocket landing in the ocean. It lands softly enough with only the parachutes on board to not necessitate fuel or landing legs, which is why I redesigned it to be a little bit simpler and just have this system works. Yeah, it's not like a real Falcon 9 because it's not rocket powered, but it's more efficient. KSP physics is very helpful for us in that manner. These parachutes have been set to deploy at 800 meters instead of 1,000 to trim how much time is necessary for this stage of the launch, because the more time we spend having to focus on this stage for it to land safely, the longer it will take to get back up to our stage that is coasting to apoapsis, which can be a problem. So obviously the margins can be improved somewhat, but I prefer to keep it at this because actually I've just noticed we were at T-minus a few seconds before apoapsis when I switched back just now. About 10 seconds, a little bit less, a little bit more, which is definitely close to being dangerous. And as you can see, our apoapsis is only 147,000. I guess that's why I previously had set the instructions to go to 200,000 or 200 kilometers. However, I figured that 5 minutes was sufficient time. Obviously 5 minutes was cutting it very close in this particular instance. And yes, this orbit is not circular, but you can see we have about 700 meters per second left. Full tank delivered to orbit. And if I want to circularize it, I can fairly effectively, although again, we're still not circular, but it's closer to circular. I'm going to go ahead and decouple this, so just leave that in space, and deorbit this stage. Obviously this stage is not designed to be recovered, however, it might actually be possible, assuming you maintain radio control. although if you have the system set to where you can full throttle without radio control, it might be possible to still have this successfully land safely. I've not attempted this, but I did discard one of these earlier. I actually haven't discarded any other stages except for that one, and that one survived all the way to crashing into the ocean. I had used all of its fuel, so it died on impact, but it did survive that far, which is why I am now going to attempt saving this one. Although that may not go as intended, as we've already lost our RTG, our only method of generating electricity other than the engine. Last time it flipped around on its own as well. I don't know why it's not doing that this time. So, while theoretically possible, obviously not going to be in this case. So, we'll just increase throttle as we thoroughly dispose of that rocket. Of course, that system on its own has a potential problem, which is those stages were dropped far in the ocean from the KSC. And the farther something is from the KSC, the less recovery value you get from recovering it. So I also made this, which is a barge, as you might have gathered. And from here, we can select whichever one of these probes we want to grab onto. But yes, now that we have targeted that particular probe, we can gauge SAS, aim at the target, which means that this vessel will start trying to pitch down, which is potentially an issue, but in reality, not really. And we can now just let this run towards the target. It will take a long time. It will take a decent amount of fuel. I don't know if the amount of fuel that it takes to go out there, retrieve a booster, and come back makes up for the difference in recovery prices, because this isn't a career save, this is sandbox, so obviously everything costs me nothing. As you can see, this has a decent top speed. You can actually increase its range, however, by throttling down, and it will maintain a pretty close to this top speed, like surprisingly close to this top speed, despite being at a significantly lower throttle. Although if I remember correctly, you still need the maximum throttle to get it started. So you can see we're maintaining about somewhere between a half and 2/3 of our top speed. So slower, but far more fuel efficient, as we're now using less than a third of the fuel, or is it exactly a third of the fuel? I forget if fuel consumption is linear on the throttle in KSP or not. And as you can see here, I have already used one of these recovery barges to tow an earlier version of the design, in fact the first version of the design with landing legs, to the island runway pretty much. And if I remember correctly, the thrust limiters on these have been shifted to account for the change in center of mass of this rear stage. Turns out it's very difficult to properly control these once they have a rocket stage attached. KSP water is somewhat sticky, so it can be hard to start moving once you're in it. By using asymmetric thrust, we can rotate this vessel a bit easier. Balancing the engines can be quite difficult. As you can see right now, we are turning to the left because this engine does not have enough thrust. I believe I may have accidentally had the wrong engine set to 51% thrust limiter, because at the time I was reversing. Obviously the speed is also reduced when you're dragging the extra mass of the rocket, both in terms of drag in the water and just extra mass. I also just realized this gives you a pretty good indication of fuel use at maximum throttle, as this particular barge was used at maximum throttle all the way out to its destination and coming back. Distances can be somewhat hard to judge in the ocean, which is why I'm looking underwater at the moment. Try not to ram it into the coastline. Just a suggestion. And safe. I think that's the closest I've ever come to ramming the coastline without actually hitting it. That's amazing. I'm actually quite impressed with that. And now the rocket stage is ready to be recovered. Obviously you could and should disconnect the barge, but whoops, too late. Anyhow, thanks for watching. And as always, I'll see you in space.